The other thing is, as we mentioned, the YouTube page, the University of Wolverhampton YouTube page, that has lots of equality and diversity events that we did last term that people can watch after this, including the events we did for Disability History Month, for Black History Month, and also a talk I did about the importance of equality and diversity in industry, and they're all available for people to see for free. And next month we will be having a whole host of events for LGBT History Month, because unlike in America, in February is our LGBT History Month rather than Black History Month. So there's plenty of events going on here at the University of Wolverhampton for our staff, students, and visitors to get involved in. And I've just been confirmed you should now be seeing the captions live. So hopefully they are working well. And I think with that, I welcome Rich Fahn of the University of Pittsburgh, who's going to talk a bit about himself and about how what we would call in Britain an Equality and Diversity Unit was founded in the aftermath of the 2016 elections. Rich, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Will. A pleasure as always, and thank you all for attending this. I've been looking forward to this since Will invited me, and I think working and talking with you all at the University of Wolverhampton is something that's going to be a really fun thing for me today. To start, my name is Rich Fan. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I come from originally Brooklyn, New York, and so if I speak really quick, that's why. My years in Pennsylvania has not slowed my method of speaking, and I know, as Will jokes sometimes with us, from two countries divided by a common language, my English may be a little weirder than the English you're used to. So with that in mind, I do want to talk a little bit about my journey, how I got to the Office of Cross-Cultural and Leadership Development, and how we try to be a aid to our students. So just as a history, our office was founded in 2007 with the intention of cultivating transformational leaders, and they could, in an effort for them to positively impact our campus, the 21st century and beyond. And so to that end, our office is unlike a lot of equity and inclusion offices in universities because we encompass diversity, equity, inclusion. We encompass fraternity, sorority life, international student programming, and leadership programming. And so those four buckets, those four pillars intertwine with one another. And so our staff are equipped not only to provide support to all of our students of various backgrounds, but also to provide very specialized support in those areas of support. Myself, I came from a career where I was seeking federal employment, working for the US government in the area of the State Department. And when I moved into higher ed, I wanted to do more, particularly after the events of the 2016 election. I wanted to do more. I had been in the past a career consultant for health-related fields, working with our underprivileged students there, helping our, what you may call BAME here in the United Kingdom, but our AAPI, African American, Asian, and Pacific Islanders get into where they needed to go in a place where they felt supported. And so after the election, we had a day where students came back. And so, like I said, we started in 2007, but in 2016, we had students en masse on our campus that were, some people were excited by the election results, others were devastated. And so we had counseling center folks come up. We had all sorts of support mechanisms. And for me, I was still in the Career Center, seeing what the CCLD office was doing. And I apologize if I use any acronyms. Cross-Cultural Leadership Development, for us, that's CCLD. Seeing what CCLD was doing for our students, it burrowed into my brain. And so 2 years later, when one of their staff members came into my office and said, "I want you to be my boss," I took that to heart. And after much consternation, I applied and then became now what I am, the Associate Director of the Office of Cross-Cultural and Leadership Development. So in this role, I help with the day-to-day operations. I assist our staff in doing the programming, and I help lead the way in terms of some of our programming that outreaches to high school and students in the collegiate level that are seeking knowledge and how to be a good leader, how to be a good person, how to learn from their neighbors and learn from the mistakes we may have made in the past where you might have stopped at the idea of tolerance. We're trying to find inclusion. We're trying to put it in a position where we're working with our Hillel office, which is housed on our floor. We're working with the Rainbow Alliance, our PIT Femmes, Feminist Empowerment Movement, our Black Action Society, which is one of our longest standing student organizations that was founded during the time of the Civil Rights Movement. We are working with our MPHC, Pan-Hellenic, and IFC groups for fraternity sorority life to have a more inclusive Greek experience, because I know here in the UK, there may not be as many opportunities to join a social fraternity organization. But in the United States, it's a big deal for students. I even just did an interview yesterday with staff where I talked about the fact that affordability for those organizations is just as important as belonging. Because if you want to persist, if you wanted to stay here at the University of Wolverhampton and you found like-minded individuals that could support, enrich, and engage you, you shouldn't have a dollar sign associated with maintaining those relationships that will be onerous. And so our office tries to apply that mindset to everything. So we don't just show up when there are bad opportunities to do so. There isn't crises that we just run like firemen and women. We want to make sure that our office is seen basically, and I don't know if you have a situation like this in Wolverhampton. Most students don't know what my office's name is. They just call it the sixth floor of the union. And they'll come up there and they see it as a safe space where they can talk to students of different races, creeds, sexual orientations, different standards of life. And they don't have to worry about being judged. They can feel safe. They can leave their book bag there and not worry about it getting stolen. If they need to take a nap, they can take a nap on a couch, no questions asked. And if they need questions to be asked, if there's a student that shows up and every time we have a program, they're hungry, we can talk to them about, hey, do you know about the food pantry? We can make those outreaches because they see us as people that want to create a sense of social responsibility, both among them, but for us as staff, because I feel like my mission statement as a career student affairs professional is if I'm not helping students, I'm not doing my job. And so with that, that's kind of an overview of the office. One last thing I would add is my partner in this, Shardina Harper, who handles most of our diversity and inclusion programming, every year puts on a social justice symposium where she brings in speakers from around the world to not only talk with our students, but staff, because obviously, I'm sure as you all experience at a university here, you may have folks that their blinders are on and their focus may be on the task at hand. And instead of a 500-foot, 600-foot view of some of the preceding factors that may prevent a student from even entering that room and how we can fix that.
Thank you for that, Rich. And I think there's a really interesting insight into your career and job. And I think, obviously, people, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We want this to be quite an interactive session because obviously the worlds of American and British higher education are so different. You know, me and Rich could try and put together a list, and we would miss something that's obvious to one or the other. But I've got a few questions for myself just to get things going. And obviously, you mentioned how fraught the 2016 election was and how that caused some introspection. But I think across the world, that similar things happened after the murder of George Floyd, the violent treatment of peaceful protests in Washington D.C. soon afterwards. You know, even in this country, this university, other universities had to take steps not just to support American students we have here, but also to support our Black students and Black staff who are very much affected by the scenes they were seeing from America. And I'd be interested to know what work you had to do with your student body during the kind of like that summer of protests and anger at racial injustice.
Well, that's a great question. Well, and I think the first answer I can say is it starts with leadership at the top. So we serve under a vice provost and dean of students, Kenyon Bonner, who engaged us and our students in a way that I think was very important in those very perilous, very stress-filled times. The first thing we did was, after we realized the gravity and the stress of our Black students on campus, we opened up our sixth floor to the counseling center and we had them available whenever the office was open. We had a counselor. You could just step off to the side, no questions asked, and you can just talk with that person. We had what we call a counselor in residence. Additionally, we just opened the floor. Us as a staff, we came in and we were there to listen. If people wanted to cry, they could cry. If they wanted to yell and scream, or if they just wanted to talk, they could. And because of, as I just mentioned, the nature of our office, we have all of these different groups. It was also an opportunity for some of them to interact with each other and support each other. For instance, for our Black students, the Asian Students Alliance didn't think about the idea of systemic police violence as it pertains to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, BIPOC. And so because of that, there were conversations at our tables about, well, what happened? How did this happen? And you mentioned George Floyd. In addition, we had a situation where Antoine Rose, a local Pittsburgh resident, was shot in the back by police. And one of the officers, the officer, in fact, that shot him was a former University of Pittsburgh police officer that had been dismissed. And so that was on top of that. a stressor for our students, because then stories of how they felt they were disenfranchised by pit police and other local police officer units were then coming to the fore, in addition to that national pain. And so to that end, our Black Action Society had a die-in, and our student affairs staff stood around and supported them. And when there were agitators who wanted to come out and disrupt the peaceful protest, we served as a buttress and a shield for those students to show them that we support them and we support their efforts. Additionally, here in the University of Pittsburgh, we also had the Tree of Life incident. And so those incidents happened on top of each other. So you had all of this pain in a month and a half period where you have systemic shootings, Black and brown folks, you have anti-Semitic bigots shooting up a synagogue, a place of worship. And so as a university, we tried to be as supportive and as overarching as we could to those situations. And for us, the first rule was take care of the student. And at times, I will admit, as a staff member, I don't think we took care of each other as well as we could have, because studies have shown, specifically here in the United States, if you are a person of color working in higher ed dealing with issues of diversity and inclusion, you have almost a 5 times higher burn rate in terms of burning out from the position because of the stress you're taking. Because most students, they see me, they see Rich, they know I'm a Black dude that they can talk to and they can feel safe. So that's a lot to have on your shoulders, but that's why I do my job. So it's easy to do it when I know I have outlets. Not too many people early in their career know about those outlets. And so it was as much education going forward after those incidents and getting younger staff prepared to find ways to outreach and get themselves supported. So we created groups for folks of color to talk and discuss about issues of the day. We now have created a group for some of our white colleagues to discuss amongst themselves some of the prevalent issues that may be coming to the fore for them and how that might be something they need to work through and understand some of the stigmas of white guilt, trauma, and those sorts of situations. And then also navigate, to be honest, a federal government that's currently trying to put different incidences in categories of if you try to mention, the president recently put out an executive order that says if you mention any specific group should keep any specific trauma or any responsibility for something their group may have done in the past, you are now working in violation of the Department of Education. It could be subject to fines, et cetera. So navigating all those things has not been easy, but it's something that's worth doing because we know those students need that help.
Yeah, on that final point, I mean, I don't know if people in the UK have heard this, but literally the Trump administration basically tried to ban schools and universities talking about the New York Times' 1619 project, the founding of slavery in North America, and the repercussions for today's society. An incredible intrusion, and a very pointed racist intrusion into people's ability to talk history, to talk society. We did actually have a question from the chat from Katie, who asks about, have you had to support students about what happened yesterday in the Capitol? And also, surely people see the stark difference in how the right agitators, insurrectionists were treated by cops compared with the Black Lives Matter protesters during the summer?
Some of that has been helpful. And I think one of the powers of social media is you have in real time photos of stair steps up to the 5th level during the Black Lives Matter protests of police, National Guard that were stationed in front of the Capitol back in the summer. And then you look at yesterday's events with the seditionists and in my opinion, traitors to our country here in the United States. And there's 3 cops on a step in front of a barricade. And so the questions have started to be asked, but as some folks have done, the response has been, sadly, well, if you were harder on those folks in the summer, you wouldn't have what you have here because they are the same, which could not be further from the truth. So we do have folks who are acting in bad faith with these discussions, but I would say to the question asker, I think for us at the university, because our students were currently in lockdown, because most of our students are at home, it's been more virtual outreach. And as folks get to us, so I mentioned my colleague Shadina. Shadina is a mother figure to all of our students of color, all of our underrepresented students. And so they will message her, they will text her. And so she has to be a rock they'll see me from time to time, or I'll have the odd person send an email or give a call or something like that while we've been home. But a lot of that has been heavy lifting by her and other folks who are the touchstones, the advisors in our student groups. So for instance, I mentioned my staff. I have one staff member who oversees National Panhellenic Council, is our historic Black fraternity sororities. He's overseeing 35, 45 students who have joined an organization with the purpose of remembering that there was a time where they weren't allowed to join other sororities and fraternities. And so a lot of those students are feeling this. I myself, I am the advisor for the incoming NAACP chapter at the University of Pittsburgh. And as we're recruiting students, as we're looking for students to join the organization, that is one of the questions that are popping up. How can we prevent this from happening? What can I do? I apologize in advance if my son comes in. He's 8 years old. Explaining to him is a lot different than talking to a college student, because to him, the first question is, how come they won't accept the loss? You tell me all the time, if I lose, I have to just shake hands and move on. And we have to have that conversation. And I'm not ready to continue that conversation into, this is what happens with police and the reaction to Black and brown folks here in the United States. Here's how you need to be careful, because he's 8. But you also have to be prepared, especially for our college students, to have counseling in place, to have mechanisms in place where they can seek help. I also serve on a committee for students in stressful situations that we can outreach and provide them with the help necessary. So to answer the question, we're doing all of those things, but it's also made infinitely harder because we're dealing with the epidemic of systemic racism and the epidemic of a global worldwide pandemic.
Thank you, Rich. We had another question actually from PE who was asking, how do you choose the acronym for the group you're mentioning, the African, Asian, Pacific Islanders? They're saying that there's a lot of acronyms out there, and the latest in the US is BIPOC. So how do you actually handle language when it comes to race equality?
A lot of it is just with race equality, just like identifiers, like I try to identify in my presentations with my pronouns. If I learn something and there's someone that corrects me, I correct. So I do want to apologize. I misspoke. I was trying to say Asian American Pacific Islanders instead of BIPOC, and they all intertwined in my brain. So AAPI is for our Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters. And so what we usually do, I don't use, but I will just talk to a student. And so a lot of times, especially now, we try to use empowerment language. We try to use, we brought in Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi, and we started talking about anti-racist and anti-racism and working through taking away the idea of, I'll say underserved, I won't say minority. I'll try to say students of color, but if it's a Black student, I'm gonna say Black student. And that way we try to name what it is, because a lot of times, like I mentioned with the Tree of Life situation, our Jewish students felt completely isolated. And then meanwhile, Antoine Rose is going on, and our Black students are feeling like, well, we don't feel like we're getting the same attention. And so managing that is very important, and also being honest when we've fallen short. So that's really, like I did with the mispronunciation of it's alphabet soup, to be honest. So sometimes we trip, we stumble, we get back up.
Yeah, and I think it's a debate that comes up quite a lot in the UK. Should you use BAME, should you use BME, should you use a different phrase? And I think getting too obsessed about the phrase is probably a mistake, because I think the opposition to them is very much what you're talking about, which is people want to be treated like individuals. People want their particular cultural background to be considered for its particular details, and not just kind of smushed together in a non-white catch-all category, which, whilst there are occasions where you can see that, white people have certain advantages that everybody else doesn't, often it's a much more nuanced situation. And to actually solve the issues, you can't just talk to all non-white people as one homogenous group. You have to talk to Black students in a different way you talk to Asian students. And obviously, one of the things we haven't mentioned, what Asian will mean in America is very different to how we will typically use in the UK, because we will primarily in our minds be thinking of students from the Indian subcontinent, whereas I assume for you, Rich, at Pittsburgh, it's more likely to be people from China, Japan, other areas of Southeast Asia in terms of their family background.
That's true. And then we'll also include the subcontinent as well, in terms of India, et cetera, because for instance, when we do the Asian Students Alliance, there are so many umbrellas from there. So we'll have the Southeast Asian Student Alliance, the Korean Student Association, the Taiwanese, and so as people break down, there's CASA, Chinese American, SASA, Southeast Asian. So they all go under that one umbrella. Oh, yes. So I saw the question about Antoine Rose. And so if you Google Antoine Rose was a young man who had been pulled over by the police. The police asked him to stop. He ran away. He was accused of being in a drive-by earlier that day, which has been proven to be incorrect. But regardless of that, he ran. The police officer fired several times into his back and he died. The officer, Rosefeld, was then put on administrative leave. And during the course of that, it was discovered he was a former University of Pittsburgh police officer, and the method by which his removal was under scrutiny, which led to, from our end as a university, lawsuits where he sued to get back his job. The audacity of that, to which I still have not gotten over to this day. And during the course of it, the biggest issue was the officer, Roosevelt, was found to have never been background checked. So every police organization that hired him after Pitt let him go, no one ever called our chief of police to ask, why did this guy leave? They just hired him off of his resume and just went. And so there you go. Yep. Valerie, thank you for looking that up. And the more you look into it, it was a situation where here in Pittsburgh, so in addition to everything that was going on, you had Antoine and you had his case coming up. And there was a belief based on all of the experts that were being put on in the trial and all of the comments that he was making that he was going to be found guilty. He was not. And so that led to a similar set of distress that we were feeling at the national level for our Black students in Pittsburgh, because at the University of Pittsburgh, a lot of our Black students that are from the area have stories of, I got pulled over and the police did X, Y, and Z. I was walking down the street and I don't feel safe. And so for us as university personnel, I have to deal with questions such as, why is it that the Black student parties have to have a police presence, but the white students don't? Why do we need a metal detector and the white students don't? And bringing that and challenging those rules with our building managers, because if I don't do it, I'm also saying either passive aggressively or I'm complicit in that continued misbehavior and that mistreatment of our Black and brown students.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Rich and Valerie. We've got some other questions. I'll move into some of the other questions from the chat. Musharat has asked, we are just starting out the process of putting in place some safe space for discussion within our allied health department. One group for BAME students and one group and staff and one group for white allies. And so there's two questions. So first of all, how do we benefit and encourage sustained involvement? How do we get the benefits of taking that approach? And second, how do we work to overcome resistance from white staff, who are the majority of staff members within that department?
I think the biggest thing I've learned, especially when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion and working with staff is, there's an old proverb, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And a lot of it is that you can give staff the baseline education, implicit bias, and it's similar to what we saw yesterday. If you give police officers training on implicit bias and knowing their blind spots and all that fun stuff, if you still see that they recognize the biases and act on them, that's where the conversations have to occur, because there is a disconnect. I think a lot of times we have meetings with folks who we need to get them in the room and we need to talk to them about, for us, we have a equity and inclusion office on top of being CCLD. So that equity and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion office, they go around and they do the trainings for staff while we work with our students and somewhat with staff through our diversity committee. And so we try to work to provide as much information as possible. But I think for the folks who are reticent and are really not interested in it, it's going to be tough. I've presented it in our school with pre-med and medical school people who are there, and you ask for 100 people and we get 7 people in the room. And to be honest, you'd rather have the 7 than have it filled to the gills and they're not listening. So I really think it's 1, patience. 2, if there are folks that are out of line and performing in an untoward manner toward either their students, staff, or faculty, you have to have mechanisms in place to address it. And then you also have to have evidence that you have addressed it and people see that there's a resolution.
Just to follow up on that, Rich, I mean, we did a race equality survey a couple of years ago now,
Mhm.
and we found significant proportion of our white staff and students have what you would call racially conservative views, the academic phrase, in the sense of why do we have to talk about this? Are white people the people who are most discriminated against? All that stuff, which is clearly not true. We have all the evidence to say it's not true. Do you get much of that pushback when you're working with students and staff members? And if you do get that pushback, how do you try and kind of overcome that?
Honestly, in student affairs here in the United States, particularly at Pitt, in my experience, we haven't had the pushback. I think the bigger issue had been outside of student affairs because we're always seen as the touchy feely, happy stuff people. And so if you're dealing with, my colleagues in residence life who deal with the on-campus students and live with them in the residence halls, that's not going to be something because it's baked in the DNA of the office. This is what we do. Now, you may have some people who don't necessarily eschew those same values, but when they get to work, they're doing their job. And so I think that's the baseline. I think that's where we start. In the case of the folks, like you said, if there are situations like that that arise, the big question is what got you to that point? And one of my colleagues, as I mentioned, Shadina, whenever she does trainings, she likes to make it a brave space where you say stuff and it's there. What you say there is there. You don't have to worry about it going back to your boss, going back to your supervisor. So if there are issues, you can handle them and talk amongst yourselves. So we've had small group opportunities that her committee has allowed us to be in where people have had some of those questions in a smaller group, but that they might never have done in front of all 200 members of student affairs. And so that's allowed them to have that conversation and not feel shouted down while also facing the alternative view of what they're saying and the reasoning behind what people are saying to get to the place where they maybe are the opposite of. And I think that's been more helpful than out and out condemnation and shouting down.
We have a couple of link questions here from Alice and Rachel. So Alice asks, universities, that they are part of their town, their city, their community, but how do you ensure that the university doesn't become a white elephant in the community, but actually interacts with its local community groups to be inclusive of everybody it kind of reaches out to? And then Rachel asks a similar question in terms of, do you do any outreach with local employers or organizations in terms of helping them tackle issues related to inclusion more effectively?
Yeah, so what we do is several prongs. One, we just started in the last, I want to say 5 years, education centers. And if you need those, I can look them up real quick and throw them in the chat. But we have community education centers where we go in and we ask them point blank, what do you need from us? Because working with our greater university outreach arms, coupled with we have what we call Pitt Serves, which is headed by our director there, Chaz Kellum. And his goal is to prevent, he comes in and talks to our leadership programming students. He talks with all of our students. His goal whenever you come to the University of Pittsburgh is not to be a volunteerist. And what he means by that is taking the photos of, I've gone to this place, look at what I've done, look how awesome it is that I've helped these poors. And that's not what we're about. And so Chaz has been really helpful for us as a partner. And that's where this all comes down to, be honest, partnerships in making sure we identify groups that we can come in, be of help to them as opposed to helping ourselves. And then also couple that with the challenge of making sure you know the community, because at the University of Pittsburgh, I'm sure like University of Wolverhampton, we're placed directly in the city. And so if we were to be bad neighbors, bad stewards, we're going to show them that quite literally to their faces. And so when we have our students living off campus, they're living with a family of 6 next door. They're living in houses with folks who have been there 30 years. And so that's where, for me, as a person who helps oversee fraternity sorority life, we talk about that idea of the privilege of, you're going to be here for a few years. They are going to be here for their lives. We have to be respectful of the space. And so when we're talking through whether it's small incidences, like, hey, maybe your party was too loud in a pre-COVID environment, to larger issues, how do we make sure we address some of the issues in the Hill District, which is an area that was predominantly Black here in Pittsburgh? It's being gentrified. So how do we address that and address incidents like the Antoine Rose incident that occurred in the Hill District, while also making sure that those folks feel like we're going to support them while being neighbors. And so that is a struggle. We make sure we continue to do those things, but you have to be honest about it. You can't just look for the photo ops. And I'm really proud to work with Chaz and his group because I know they don't do that.
That brings up a question I've been interested in, which is obviously you talk about supporting student fraternities, student organizations. These don't necessarily map on exactly to what we have in the UK, but what we do have in terms of liberation societies, religious and cultural societies, they'd actually be handled by a independent students' union that the university doesn't directly manage at all. We give them a block grant for funding, but they are actually an autonomous representative group, and the students' union can clearly disagree with the university because it's a separate organization. So how do you manage that working relationship with these student organizations that may be looking to push the policies of the university in ways the university doesn't want to go?
I think really having leadership at the top that's going to support us as we make those initiatives. I think for us, especially like I retweeted on my account this morning, our chancellor putting out a statement 9 hours ago that denounced everything going on with the sedition occurring at the Capitol. That's big for me. As a staff member, I can say, in my personal opinion, having our university say this is wrong, it's so easy as universities to just kind of float in the middle and then wait for the weight of expectation to fall on you, and then you make a reaction. For our chancellor to do so and do it that succinctly and that powerfully was something that, as a staff member, I know we're doing it as best as we can the right way. Now, that doesn't mean, like you said, there are going to be situations that pop up. Early on, I can think of, when we had Milo Yiannopoulos and we had some of these other speakers on campus, and we have a rule of, if you can not necessarily debate them because they're being brought by a student organization, but you can ways you can respectfully protest. You can provide alternative information. You can counter program. But what we don't want it to be is a situation where you're shouting from the back and it's just art, because no one is going to be heard and no one's going to understand. And it becomes a both sidism situation. And I think that stuff we've learned to navigate, because I think you have the right to free speech. We have the Pitt Promise, which essentially says that, it's like the golden rule. You're going to be respectful because I'm respecting you, and we're going to be good partners here at the university. And I think that's helped. But I think when it comes to those bigger political issues, for instance, when our president recently said that there was going to be a ban on our international students at the beginning of this semester, the university joined with several other higher education institutions in the United States and countersued and had that struck down. And so making those decisions at somewhere above me, folks said this isn't right and we're going to push this legally. And so having the political muscle and the will to do that is as important as actually, taking that step. Because if you take that step and you're not supported top to bottom, it's just going to be you stepping out there on your own.
Yeah. We have a question about, in terms of support and staff members. We have a question about, do you have things such as staff networks to facilitate such a community? So in the UK, we will have staff networks for our different liberation groups. So we have a disabled staff network, a Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff network, LGBT plus staff network, women's staff network. And if you do, what resources are provided to such a community, a staff community? And if you don't, is there a particular reason why not?
We do have several different staff organizations where they can come. As a large global, we have our staff council. And so that's kind of like our political arm, where issues as a whole from staff and faculty can be brought to the university's powers that be. We also have the little affinity groups which meet. And then after that, we also have, when I first was hired at Pitt, we started a mentoring program that kind of fell by the wayside, and then they reinstituted. So we also have that set up as well. So that way you have people a little further down the road or a little bit further up the road, so to speak, depending on where you are in your career, that can help you and kind of talk you through things. And we encourage mentorship. And so for me, I think that's really important, because if you don't have those outlets, you're going to feel separated. The events of the last few months or a few years really have necessitated us being more vigilant with those groups. And I think as a result, that's been really helpful. I think one good example I have is one of my staff members, Andre, created a men's meeting group where we read, and bear with me, I think I actually have it over here. I moved it. Oh, the joys of public moving things around in your bedroom during a pandemic. We all, as a group, there was several of us from different races, backgrounds, all people that identified as male, read Feminist Fight Club and talked through it and talked through some of the issues that were laden within some of the toxic male tributes we might bring to the table in a meeting and not even know it. And so that was a great place for us all to talk in a very safe environment where no, it didn't leave the room of what this is, what does manhood mean, how does it mean different things to different people, and what we can do as student affairs professionals and as folks outside of the student affairs bubble to make sure we don't put ourselves in a position where we're part of the problem. And I say that because a lot of times people might, you don't want the performative nature of I'm here with you. That's the one thing, especially for CCLD. I never want any of my students in Rainbow. I don't want any of my students in BAS. I don't want any of my students in ASA, Hillel, Feminist Empowerment Movement, Fraternity Sorority Life to ever see me as a passenger. The only way I'm a passenger is that they're going to drive the conversation and I'm just going to be there to give them help when they need it. If I'm ever seen as a person who's just a gatekeeper or someone who, why is Rich, what purpose does he serve? I feel like I failed in my job.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've got another question here from PE, which is about what does federal level equality legislation look like? In the UK, we have the Equality Act 2010, but obviously I understand some of your policies are statewide. Have you experienced differences in expectations when students come from different states?
That's a great question. I think for us, I haven't experienced it, and I'd have to defer to my colleague Shadina on that. But I know from my experience with dealing with our students from different countries, I think the biggest thing is they'll ask questions. Like I mentioned with the Antoine Rose situation, having a lot of our students who aren't from the United States ask about, well, why wouldn't you just comply with the police? Why would you run from the police? And then having that unpacked, it's a matter of trust again, and that's a big thing with our office. When you're on that floor, you have to be able to ask a question and not have your head bitten off for it. And so in that moment, there might not be every Black student that's on that floor that's equipped. And so that's where I could come in and kind of mitigate and explain, or another student that is a little bit more emotionally in check can do so. And I think that goes for a lot of things. I mentioned earlier at the very beginning, the idea of like, you have 101, 201, all the way up to like 1001. When you have, for instance, someone that accidentally, having a student need avocation because their professor is calling them by their dead name, or you have a situation where I deal with this a good deal, where students are talking to you and something comes up and then you ask them about it. It's like, oh, that's no big deal. And you have to explain to them why this shouldn't happen. For instance, when I was in the Career Center, the one thing I would always tell students is you have the right to have your name pronounced correctly. There is no escape, especially for us in Pittsburgh. If we have Yevgeny Malkin and we have all these other Penguins and Steelers and all these names that people can roll off the tongue with aplomb, they can get your name correct. And so that's something where you have to advocate for the student and you have to educate the student. And then if they come in and they say, in my country, we're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z, that's where, as an example, during orientation, having students identify where they're from. And our vice provost and dean of students does a great job with this during every orientation for us, or now welcome week, I guess is what we call it. You see firsthand everyone and everywhere, and then we'll have icebreakers where, the stand up, sit down if you've experienced this. And then we can kind of talk through and break down what that is. But it also has to, like I said before at the very beginning, it has to be trust. Because if you go into that and you're standing up like, I have no problem talking about my own background. Stand up if you're homeless. There was a time when I was homeless when I was a kid, and I had to work on public assistance. And that was something that resonates with me to this day, where I try to work with homeless shelters. I try to work with homeless ministries. And that's something I have no problem with, but there might be a student in the room that didn't know that about me, or that I'm a first generation college student. And so when they hear that, they now know, oh, wow, I can talk to Rich. I did a talk similar to this actually in our library a year and a half ago, where it was all first generation students who graduated and then worked in higher education. And, having students appreciated the fact they get to see a way forward. And so the more we can do that and make those connections, I think the more those kind of what's legal in my state or what is said, it makes it easier to have those conversations without folks feeling like, ethnocentrism kicks in and says that's wrong or this is right.
I think on the law side, I mean, America's a fascinating patchwork because there's a lot of things that are legal in some states that would be illegal in this country. Affirmative action, positive discrimination. In some states, that's much. There's much more leeway to do that in America than there is in Britain. But then again, you think one of those states would be California. Back in November, they had a referendum to uphold their ban on affirmative action. So it's a very complex patchwork of different laws and approaches. Um, we've got another question here from Nazira, who's also our OVC lead for equality, who has asked, she thanks you for delivering the session, Rich. She asks, what is your university's approach to developing inclusive curriculum and staff training?
I think that goes back to our ODI, or Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. They work a lot in concert. Additionally, we have different mechanisms in each part of the university. Our HR department, our in CCLD, Shardina does a lot of training, and we have branch campuses, our sister campuses at smaller cities and towns around the greater Western Pennsylvania area. And so she'll present there. We have other people who go around and present, and it's really based on a collective model of education and getting people to a certain level. And so because of that, that does lead to sometimes things being not necessarily repeated, but yeah, like you're going to have a lot of anti-bias trainings. You're going to have a lot of learning about insert subject here. And I think it's better to have too much than not enough, because you're always going to have folks. I always think about it like the addiction model. When you think about it as a clinician, you're talking to someone, it might not be the first session, it might not be the first person, it might be the 50th, 100th, 2000th person that gets through to someone. And so you have to constantly pepper people with this information and training. Otherwise, you never know when it's going to affect them.
Have you had much student activism about, more diverse reading lists, maybe taking down names of or statues around the campus? Has that been an issue in Pittsburgh in recent years?
Oh yes, we have the Wright statue as the gentleman who created Oh Susanna, who is known to have used numerous things, like Stephen Foster. I'm sorry, Stephen F. Foster. So we had the Stephen F. Foster outside of the Carnegie Mellon. I'm sorry, let me back up. My brain stopped working. I got to reset it. Outside of our Carnegie Library. So there was a statue of Stephen F. Foster, and he has a slave essentially looking up at him with wonder as he's playing his guitar and singing. And so students, when they saw that, especially during the statue removal push, said this is not okay. And it wasn't on university ground, it was on the museum's ground. They removed it and they're putting something in its place. But we still have the Stephen F. Foster Memorial Theater. And it's one of those things where we had a few of our residence halls and some of our university buildings were named after people who were in the Tuskegee experiments. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Tuskegee experiments were a shameful time in American history where they experimented on Black and brown folk and just used us as guinea pigs with no recourse and no sense of any remorse after the fact. And so those names were changed. And I think it was a process by which the university they listened to our students, and it was student driven. Same thing with our Black students recently made public demands to the university on issues they wanted addressed in terms of how things were done. And they're working with universities higher ups to get that done. And same thing with our Asian American students, and same thing with, we have a student government board. Things are brought up there, and the SGB president is dealing with it at their level in terms of what is seen as valid programming for groups and not valid for others, how much funding goes to this group as opposed to another group. And so we're dealing with it at every level of the university. And I think the biggest thing is, especially in light of everything going on, the fact that people are listening. If the students felt completely unheard, that is an invitation for them to leave. And if you're losing those students of color, then you're losing the opportunity to take what is primarily a primarily white institution and provide the depth and diversity it needs for those students as much as our students of color. Oh, you're muted, Will.
We almost got through a whole talk without me accidentally leaving myself on mute. No, that's very much the issue of non-continuation is very much an issue here in the UK, and unfortunately, it's an issue that hits Black and Asian students particularly hard for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about today. We've got an interesting question here from Fiona. She says, "I'm really interested in the research you mentioned that shows Black staff are more likely to get burnt out with issues presented by Black students. I've noticed a similar issue as a disabled staff member being seen as more approachable for that reason by disabled students. I'd personally add to that, speaking to Black staff members in faculties, I think they also experience the same thing here at Wolverhampton." And she just asked, if you could direct her to the research you mentioned, that would be greatly appreciated. And I think we've got a question here from Claire, which I think will be the last question we have. So if anybody has any final questions for Rich, write them down now. So Claire asks, how do you evaluate the impact of your work so you know that your resources are being used effectively to meet your aims? And I think we are all trying to evaluate things. So she has I think it would be fair to say, a plea, any creative ideas would be welcome. So yeah, so what approach do you take to things like evaluation and kind of proving the worth of the work you're doing?
The joys of multitasking. I just threw in the chat one of the scholarly journals I have referred to whenever I meet with some of my fellow professionals of color on burnout and talking through you're not alone. And so it's Racial Battle Fatigue in the Black Student Affairs Professional in the Era of #Black Lives Matter by Miracle Husband. And so Miracle has a number of other books and things cited in her journal in her document that I would definitely encourage people to read and look through and evaluate on your own. And I think especially for the first question for our able-bodied folks or that don't think about some of those issues or constantly going to our folks that aren't able-bodied, that is it's the same thing. And I think I usually do a beads exercise where we go around and you grab a bead if you have this privilege, and by the time you get around, everyone's got at least a wristband because you don't realize the privilege. And so for the folks who don't have to deal with issues of say here at the university we had to do remodeling, so for any of our staff members that use wheelchairs, the question was, well, how do you remodel and not have wheelchair accessible entrances to the university? And then it's back to the drawing board. You got to figure that out because obviously here in the United States, we have laws for those things, but also it's just the common sense of if you put someone on the 8th floor and you're telling them they can only take the stairs to come down and they're in a wheelchair, how does that work? And so we have to work through that stuff all the time. And I think that the fatigue of constantly having to be the person in the room to raise your hand and ask, it's a lot. And then also having to advocate, because you have to advocate for yourself as much as the students. And then for the second question, Will, it was, how do we know there's a success? Like, what are the markers of success? And for me, as a higher education professional, I see success as in the anecdotes and seeing the action, because I know a lot of these programs, it's going to be singing to the choir, so to speak, and they're going to be the same active people that have been at this program. But for me, it's when I get a letter from a student when they graduate and they thank me for something that we did, or it's talking with a student that I helped navigate a really difficult situation and they appreciated it. Or then for us as a university, having folks tell our directors, our deans, our associate deans, we're doing good work. You need to support these people more. And I know, I mentioned her name several times, but Shadina Harper, she is a rock star in our office, and she goes completely at times unnoted in terms of, not in our office, but I think the university has a representative that is doing the work and doing it to the best of her ability. And she could be, and it could be crushing, especially during this time where you're alone, you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of students, and she is just every single time answering the bell. And so honoring that, you have to find ways, and I don't know if you all do that at Wolverhampton, where you can just take the time to thank and appreciate some of those folks. And that goes so much longer than the official decree from your dean or whatever. If it's just a note, an email, a call, I think that sort of stuff keeps all of us going, and it's no different for us in the States.
No, I very much agree with that point. I think it is important to have that kind of feedback and value that feedback. Final few questions. From Valerie, she just asked, can you please share a link to the bead exercise? She also says it's helpful to get different models, again, people to make privilege more visible. In that regard, do you refer people to the videos or book by Robin DiAngelo?
I haven't seen Robin's work, so I can't speak to it, so I apologize. Will, could you give me some background on that one?
I've blanked on what the name of her book was. I think it's White Fragility. So she was the one that was in the New York Times for a while. I think the issue I've found, and I've read a few things from Robin, is she's a white practitioner. Obviously, I'm a white practitioner too, and I think sometimes it's important to, when you're designing programs, is to consult the lived experience quite closely. And I'm not entirely sure that she's cracked it as much as her reputation would suggest, particularly when she is quite expensive as well. But yes, as you don't know, Rich, we will leave that one.
Oh, but I do have someone that I would recommend at the university, especially in our office. We had Minnie Jean and I want to say it was Jane Elliott. And so Minnie Jean, for those of you who don't know who Minnie Jean Brown Trickey is, she was a member of the Little Rock Nine, which was one of our first desegregated schools. So she was one of the kids who integrated at the time. And when you see the photo, and I don't know if I can share screen, but if I can.
You get just a green button at the bottom, Rich.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna bear with me. I got to make it full, so I want to so you can get the full image here. And so let's see. I'm usually much better with technology, y'all, so don't. Okay, so you can see Minnie Jean right here. Minnie Jean is right here up front, and this is her walking into school. And this woman here, her daughter went to school with Minnie Jean, and years later they did an article where they tried to reconcile, and it was good, but then years later she kind of started to bend more towards I had nothing to apologize for, and so that became strained. But Minnie Jean came to our university along with Jane Elliott. Jane Elliott is a woman after Dr. MLK was shot who did the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment with her students, and to show them in real time what discrimination and what maybe some of her white students didn't understand about what was going on during the civil rights movement. And so when you watch Jane's videos, she does a lot in a short period of time. One of the best videos she shows is, and we'll share this with our students, she'll come back before COVID, she would come and speak. And a couple of years ago, I was honored to have both of them there at the same time. Jane had the entire student affairs staff, look around, and she brought up this issue of, a lot of people think if Black folks were to be treated the way they wanted to be treated, they would want revenge for everything that's ever happened. They just want to be left alone. And she would I'm kind of microwaving it, so I apologize, but she would go around to every single Black person in the audience, and the answer would just be, no, I just want to be, not think about these things, not have these anxieties, not have these concerns for our family, friends, and loved ones. And that sort of talk coming from her, from a position of privilege, and then being able to then push back because she's saying it, has been very helpful. And I think it's different than in the way I did read the White Fragility book, but I've never watched any of her videos. So it's a lot, but it's also what you need. Some people need to hear that. Just like with Dr. Kendi, when he comes and he talks about anti-racism, and we have an anti-racism curriculum at the university we've been doing with our first year students. And for myself as a staff member, we've been doing it at the executive level. That is helpful because you're now talking about these things at a time in an environment where it might not always be comfortable. And you need to push through that, and you need to do it both from that educational level with the students and with that educational and professional level with the staff, because we have to understand what the fight is. And if we all are understanding what it is, it'll make it that much harder to fight.
Can you just give us something? What type of things are covered in the anti-racism course you're doing with your students and staff, and how much time is dedicated to it? Because that sounds a really interesting initiative.
Yeah, sure. So it's called it's Pit, because of course we're going to have all these numbers. I'm going to share the link for you because I think this will do it better justice than I would. Yep, and actually, yep, I just saw it. Video. So there you go. That is all of the information. This is frequently asked questions about the course, what's covered. And so it is a 14-week course, just like any of our other courses here at the university. We're on a 15-week program. 15th week would be finals for us at the university. And then the detailed course selection has the lecture recording. So if any of you would like to take our course, you're welcome, I believe. Let me double check. I don't want to set you up for failure here. Nope, they're open to the public. So if you go there, it not only has the videos of the lecture, but it has under it the required readings from which the lecturer provided insight.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. I'll take a look at that afterwards. Just a final few things to finish up on. So I'm just going to rattle through these. I think we've covered these off. So first, we had someone raised a point about how do you address the challenge of preaching to the choir. And I think you've spoken about the fact that actually a lot of it is just trying to reach the people who want to be reached and hope they set a positive example. We've had a Valerie really agree on the point about correct name pronunciation. I agree. I think it's really important. I am somebody that can be bad for name pronunciation, and word pronunciation more generally, but it is really important because you always got to think about it. It's not just you who's mispronouncing someone's name. It is like every other person they interact with that day. You can only just imagine how grating that is. I know there was a London university, I think it was UCL, that actually had students record how they pronounced their name so that staff members could actually bring that up and listen to it back, which I think is a very positive thing. We've had some positive feedback. So Veronica says thank you for the talk, and she also mentions that she feels burnout trying to support BAME students. So that we know is an issue. And I think we need to do things to support our Black staff who are playing that role. And we've just had CAF say thank you as well for the talk as well. I have one final question for you, Rich, but I just want to give you the floor to say any final comments before I try and leave us on a positive note to contrast with the negative note we started on talking about what happened over the summer and yesterday.
Sure. So I want to thank you all for the time. It's an honor to represent my university, my alma mater, my office, and my colleagues and friends, and just giving you insight what we do at the university and how even across the pond there are a lot of issues that we have as universal truths and universal challenges. And I think the one thing I can say to the folks who have been saying, the burnout, for me, I always feel like, and this is you can be agnostic, you could be not religious, but I felt like being in student affairs is a higher call. It's like my calling. I feel like I get up and my mission in life is to help people, and it's to be there like someone maybe wasn't for me when I was a first gen student. And I think paying that forward and giving that time I'm a big idea on sliding doors and butterfly effects when it comes to investing in students. And I've always adhered to the principle of you never know who you're going to help and who they're going to help. And I think that would be my positive input. I think all of this is hard work. No one ever is going to say it isn't, but I think it's worth it because you never know which one of those students is going to go on and make that next move that pushes us forward, or which staff member who you never in a million years thought was going to use pronouns respectfully for the folks that provided to them, use them. And those little victories are what push me as much as the big ones.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We just had Sheila Gill, who's former chair of our BAME Staff Network and also our trade union, one of our trade union quality officers, just thank you for the talk and says it's really interesting to hear what you're doing and how you're changing lives and keep the faith. And this is what kind of to bring us full circle. Obviously, we have talked about some of the negatives that have happened in America, But on Tuesday, I think we had a really exciting thing where we were talking a few minutes ago about the civil rights movement, where we had Raphael Warnock, the pastor of what was once Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, be elected as the new senator for Georgia, the first African American to become a senator from election since Reconstruction. The other African American in the US Senate from the South, Tim Scott, was initially appointed. Just an amazing day for America and for race equality, particularly in the South, Rich.
Yeah, and I think one of the messages folks have understood, especially Will and I, we're colleagues, we're friends, we've talked about this stuff professionally and personally. One of the things I think people haven't understood historically in the United States and the South is that you could talk red or blue, but a lot of those states which predominantly contain the majority of Black folk in the United States are purple, and you would never know it because of voter suppression and a history Reconstruction of suppression of Black voices. And I think if there's one thing I took from 2020's election and this subsequent 2021 runoff, it's that when you give folks a chance to have their voice heard, you will hear it loud and clear. Now, will you listen is going to be the next question.
That's excellent. Big thank you again for sparing the time, Rich. And we did manage to just about keep to an hour, which is good for us. Thank you again for everybody who's came on the call. This will be available on YouTube, and hopefully we'll be able to capture the chat transcript as well and incorporate that into the YouTube description as well. So this talk will be available at some point in the near future. But big thank you again, and also for everybody. I did at Christmas get Rich 100 Great Black Britons. So he has. We have learned from Rich today. Rich will be learning from what's happening in Britain, and obviously that was co-authored by Patrick Vernon, who is a great representative of Wolverhampton. So thank you again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week.